right. Should we do it? All right. Should we do it? All right. Good evening, everybody. Thank you for your patience. Welcome. My name is Danny Hoffman. I am the director of the Henry M. Jackson School of International Studies here at the University of Washington. I'm sweating just like all of you, so thank you for your patience. I do have to say, as somebody who now spends most of my day sending emails, I get very excited to walk in and stand in front of a room full of people interested in intelligent conversation, so thank you for being here. I'd like to begin, as we always do at our Jackson School public events, by situating the school. We acknowledge that we are on Coast Salish territory, the traditional homelands of the Duwamish, Suquamish, Tulalip, Muckleshoot, and other indigenous peoples. The Jackson School understands that the international community includes sovereign American Indian tribes, First Nations, and indigenous peoples across the world. Now, it's an honor for me to welcome you to tonight's event. We're very fortunate in the Jackson School to have Stephen Simon on our faculty as a visiting professor this academic year, and I'm grateful to Stephen for generously agreeing to share his expertise with us tonight and throughout the year. Now, in just a moment, I will invite my colleague and former Jackson School Director, Resat Kasaba, to introduce Stephen. Before I do, though, I want to thank all of you for being here. I know that many of you are students, faculty, staff, or friends of the Jackson School. This is not the first time you've come to Kane Hall at 7:30 in the evening to participate in a precious and important ritual, public intellectual engagement. In our teaching in the Jackson School, we try to instill in our students the idea that you cannot meaningfully engage with the world without listening. To truly understand world events and how they impact our lives, one needs to speak multiple languages, one needs to be open to other cultures and perspectives, and you need to know your history. Whenever we can, we throw the Jackson School doors open and ask members of our community whether those values still resonate outside the classroom. By you being here tonight, you demonstrate that you do, those values do still matter, and for that, I would like to thank you. So a quick word about our format. So in just a moment, we will invite Stephen to the podium to give his talk. There are cards being passed around, and we will pass out more if you need them by our volunteers here. What we'll ask you to do is we welcome your questions. We want, when Stephen is done, to engage with in dialogue with you, but we would ask that you please write your questions down and pass those to the volunteers that will be on the sides of the aisles. You don't need to wait until the talk is over. In fact, we'd appreciate it if you didn't. Certainly at any point, if you have a question, write it down, just pass it down to the end of the aisle. And when Stephen is finished with his talk, Resat will present a selection of questions from the audience. I appreciate your patience with this process, but we found that it allows us to consolidate questions and also to just cover a wider range of topics, so thank you for that. Now, when our event has concluded, Stephen will be outside the lecture hall signing books, and so we would invite you to join us out there. And I want to thank the UW Bookstore for partnering with us to make that possible. And on the subject of thanks, I want to extend my gratitude to the Middle East Center, Department of Middle Eastern Languages and Cultures, the Center for Global Studies, for co-sponsoring this evening's event. Many thanks to the students and staff volunteers who made this all possible, and a special note of appreciation to Damian Peterson and Monique Thorman for working so hard to put all the pieces together. So with that, it's my pleasure to invite to the podium someone that I know that many of you know. Professor Resat Kasaba is an expert in the history and politics of the Middle East, with active current research on U.S. foreign policy in Turkey and on the urban-rural divide in Turkey. He's been recognized globally for his expertise in speaking to unfolding current events around the Middle East and recognized locally for his distinguished teaching. I will also add that he's been a very generous mentor to me, having served as the director of the Jackson School for 10 years, and you're always welcome to come back. So thank you all very much. Welcome to that.
Thank you, Danny, and thank you all for coming. A special shout out to my students in JSIS 200. I'm very happy to see you here. Very nice. We are very pleased to have Stephen Simon with us tonight and this academic year as visiting professor of practice and Middle East studies. Previously, Stephen was Robert E. Wilhelm Fellow in International Affairs at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and Research Fellow at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. He has served at various senior positions in the U.S. government, most prominently on the National Security Council, at the Clinton White House, and also at the Obama White House. He has also served in the State Department in various posts in Washington, D.C. and overseas. Since leaving the government, Stephen has consulted with some private firms in the private sector, both again here and overseas. He has also worked on projects at RAND Corporation and also at the Council on Foreign Relations. He has taught various places, Princeton, Dartmouth, Colby, and Amherst College, among them. Nothing as illustrious as University of Washington, of course. We're very happy to have him here. Stephen is also one of those rare individuals who has put in a lot of time and energy in explaining and drawing on his expertise, writing books and articles. I counted, I may be wrong, but he has about 7 books that he either wrote or co-authored, and numerous articles in various places. His opinion editorials appeared in the New York Times, Washington Post, Financial Times, Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, Politico, New York Review of Books, Survival, Haaretz, and also he has appeared on the PBS NewsHour, ABC News, CNN, and Al Jazeera. Now, I and my colleagues really feel so proud if we get one thing published in one of those places. So this is an incredible record. So, and his expertise is always on demand. Just to give you an idea, just yesterday or today, he has a piece published in Foreign Affairs contemplating the future of Gaza already. And he's also planning to chair a roundtable discussion in Washington, D.C. next week. So we are really privileged that he is here with us this year and tonight. Stephen's, the most recent book, which came out in April 2023, is Grand Illusion, The Rise and Fall of American Ambition in the Middle East. And this was a book that was selected as one of the best books for 2023 by the New York Times. So we are really very proud to have Stephen with us. One of the reviews of his recent book described him as a really erudite witness and a historian. So we're very pleased to have Stephen here. And the title of his presentation is the second half of the title of his book, The Rise and the Fall of American Ambition in the Middle East. Thank you very much.
Thank you for those kind introductions. I think they were so generous, we can move right to Q&A. Is that okay? Ladies and gentlemen, first of all, thanks for coming out tonight. I really appreciate it. It's a great welcome to the University of Washington for me. So thank you for making me feel at home. I really appreciate that. Look, it's a strange moment, isn't it? Gathering here to talk about the United States and Middle East after the 7 October assault on Israel and what could be just the first phase of an Israeli response. It's a bit unsettling. I'm sure many here tonight will wish to discuss the crisis, and I want to have plenty of time for that. I'll make a few observations about it towards the end of my book talk, and then, of course, there are Q&A. Otherwise, I'll be discussing the book, which actually isn't such a bad way to begin to think about Israel, Gaza, and the drumbeat of a wider war. The thing is, earlier this year, I was congratulating myself on my exquisite timing, because it's not everyone who publishes a book about the Middle East just as war breaks out in Eastern Europe and tensions with China are at an all-time high. I'm regretting the irony right now. Okay, that's one thing. I might add, just in the category of slice of life human interest, that Grand Illusion wasn't even the book I wanted to write. My first pitch was for a book about my college thesis advisor, Professor Morton Smith, who was a combination of Indiana Jones and the hero of the Da Vinci Code. He made a mint with a book that depicted Christ as a gay magician, believe it or not, based on his discovery of a long-lost ancient document in a remote desert monastery. It doesn't get better than that, really, does it? His work has inspired a whole new subfield of ancient history wherein scholars grapple with the deep question whether he was brilliant and lucky or brilliant and a forger. So I was really looking forward to that, but my publisher said it wasn't such a great idea. He said I should consider it as a posthumous project where I'd have plenty of time to work on it and I wouldn't have to worry about reviews. He wanted a big book about the United States and Middle East, which had been my day job for decades. He wanted a memoir. I considered this, but really wasn't prepared for the depth of introspection it would require. And I doubted that my personal experience, although pretty rich, as you might expect of my professional environment, would be especially compelling for readers, especially outsiders. So I shifted gears a bit and settled on writing a book in which I would be the narrator, a witness to events, but also chronicler and analyst. I confined my cameos to specific episodes where my personal experience would shed light on things in a way that the archives could not. In instances where my recollection of events was contradicted or unsupported by the archives and or my colleagues' memories, and there were several such instances, by the way, I ditched my own take in favor of others. The memory, I discovered, is quite a tricky thing. And it was startling sometimes to see the archives show that what I'd been remembering for years was just wrong. Very, very strange. And of course, it instilled a deep distrust of anything I read by anybody else. In the end, the concept worked, but mostly because my government career coincided with an unprecedented surge of American military intervention in the Middle East, starting in Ronald Reagan's first term, which began in 1981, and ended just as the surge was sputtering out in Barack Obama's second term, which ended in the second part of Obama's first term, which ended in January 2013. So as I began to plot a course for the book, I thought about a previous one I did with a colleague, Ray Takei, historian of Iran at the Council on Foreign Relations. Thank you. I was talking about Ray Takei at the Council on Foreign Relations. He's quite a character. Anyway, we did a book on the United States and Middle East in the Cold War. It was a kind of a textbook for Norton. The remarkable thing about that era, or at least the early and mid-Cold War years, was the way in which the U.S. achieved virtually all of its strategic objectives in the region at an extraordinarily low cost in blood and treasure. This wasn't the result of divine inspiration or Olympian policymaking or anything like that, but specific factors that proved favorable. Pragmatism in Washington, the friendship of conservative monarchies in the region, which proved more reliable for us, by and large, than the Soviets' partners were for them, the presence for a time of the Royal Navy in the region and their air base in Egypt, and after that, like-minded regimes to take care of business. The contrast between that dispensation and the late Cold War and post-Cold War years was jarring. In the period covered in this book, the arc of intervention, itself a departure from the practices of an earlier era, was one of staggering costs and mostly negative returns, and not just for the United States. In the region, hundreds of thousands were killed or displaced by U.S. interventions. The book evolved, therefore, into a detailed attempt to answer the question, what went wrong? The answer, of course, is a lot. The main problem, I concluded, and I suppose this is the conceit of the book, it was the grand delusion of the book's title. A delusion, I have to emphasize, is not just an idea that's disconnected from the facts, but it's one that's impervious to contrary evidence. That's what makes it a delusion. The latter point is critical from the perspective of the book, which is why readers, and I do hope you read the book, will find a substantial body of declassified intelligence reports from these years that were launched as flares when policymakers' preferences were delusional. Everybody okay up there? What was the delusion? Probably the best banner for it was the one raised by George Herbert Walker Bush. The New World Order was his banner, and that was circa 1991. During the period covered by the book, successive administrations before and after George Herbert Walker Bush had their own formulations. These differed in vocabulary, but not in conceptual content. Jimmy Carter had a human rights orientation. Ronald Reagan had his freedom crusade. George Herbert Walker Bush had the aforementioned New World Order. Bill Clinton had enlargement of democracies. George W. Bush had his freedom agenda. Barack Obama had, for a brief time, something akin to responsibility to protect, a legal doctrine that justifies intervention for humanitarian purposes. But this had largely faded in his second term, displaced by his "don't do stupid stuff" credo. You can figure out what he actually said, but that's Republican consumption. Now, Donald Trump repudiated the idea of intervention entirely with one significant exception: the targeted killing of an Iranian official near Baghdad in 2020. He shared Obama's disdain for the old delusions, promulgating a theory of statecraft one might label, "what's in it for me?" Biden is harder to pin down. In a sense, his administration is more interesting than his recent predecessors. I'm well aware of the controversy it has generated, and I'm not here to pass judgment, but he has blended restraint and assertion, I think, in novel ways. Okay. Going back to interventionists, all of their bumper stickers shared a family resemblance to George H.W. Bush's New World Order. There was nothing intrinsically wrong about the sentiment in the abstract. There was, however, something amiss in the connection policymakers drew between their idea of liberty and the problems, concerns, and aspirations of the people on whom these policymakers wish to confer that idea. Now, together with a second linked delusion that the U.S. had the power to impose a new world order on the Middle East, the persistent notion of a new world order engendered a world of hurt. The idea originated with America's experience of a post-war preponderance of power in Mel Leffler's memorable book title, and its response to comprehensive defeat in Vietnam despite this preponderance. The delusion also had its banner, shock and awe. The key point here is that the power to get your way in international affairs requires something more than and different from an $885 billion defense budget with 1.4 million men and women in uniform. That I believe is the fiscal year 24 request to Congress. You've got to have realistic objectives linked to real interests and a military strategy matched to these things, and commanders who can carry it out. In the Cold War, say in Europe, successive U.S. administrations valorized democracy and freedom and lamented the situation in countries where the USSR had deprived populations of their freedom. But these administrations were very cautious in their assessments of U.S. power vis-a-vis the Warsaw Pact, that is the Soviet Union and its allies in Europe, and from President Eisenhower onward, rejected the idea of liberating these countries from Soviet rule. Containment of the USSR never turned into rollback, at least until after the collapse of the Soviet state and its military power. Uprisings in Hungary in 1956 and Czechoslovakia in 1968 prompted Hallmark cards from Washington in lieu of the U.S. actually coming to the party. The rhetoric of freedom could coexist quite peaceably with a cautious foreign policy. Ideas are vital, but so is the cold reality of the military balance and costs of war. In subsequent years, however, the boundary between these two domains became increasingly porous. Now, it's true that these administrations had some pretty strange ideas about Soviet power and its intentions to seize Saudi or Iranian oil, a real preoccupation in the 1980s for the United States. A special national intelligence estimate from that era spooked policymakers and military planners, injecting urgency into the nascent U.S.-Israeli strategic cooperation program and the search for bases in the Persian Gulf. To some extent, ideology was at work, of course, but in the Cold War context and Soviet resistance to penetration by U.S. intelligence agencies and, more broadly, the closed nature of Soviet society, these mistaken ideas were, in a sense, less delusional than they were worst-casing, of the kind you do when you don't have enough information and your adversary is clearly pretty powerful. Naturally, these delusions were superimposed on the usual distorting factors. Domestic politics, a big one, naturally. Bureaucratic politics, cognitive biases, the sort of hardwired flaws in the way human beings apprehend the world, psychological factors, the tendency of U.S. policymakers and planners not to think through the what next question. So we do this, what does the other guy do? That's one of those questions that's asked only infrequently. And they forget that, as James Mattis, a former four-star general who was Donald Trump's Secretary of Defense for a while, he likes to say, the enemy gets a vote too. And then, of course, there's the distorting factor of just luck, both kinds, good and bad. Anyway, this is one level on which you can read the book if you get around to it. But it can also be read as an insider account of the specific ways in which these delusions enmesh the United States in such a costly way. In other words, it's meant to be a real yarn. It's fast-paced, brimming with vivid details. And what I'm going to do in this talk is just to share a few snapshots, aspects of each of these administrations that contributed to the somewhat grim overall reading of U.S. Middle East policy during the long arc of intervention. So Reagan's two terms were especially fascinating for me, and there's a disproportionate amount of space in the book allocated to that administration in the 1980s. Obviously, it was a chance to get in touch with my younger self. That was a mixed, bag. But in a nutshell, he was the one, Ronald Reagan was the one who kicked off the enduring trend, or seemingly enduring trend, of exaggerating the importance of events in the Middle East to the United States and expanding the scope of U.S. interests beyond what would normally, in a sort of common sense way, been construed to be strategic interests. He did so in 1982 by declaring the freedom of the Lebanese people, who were in the middle of a brutal civil war, to be globally important. He inserted ground forces to defend, quote unquote, civilization, and got trounced by Syria and Iranian proxies at the cost of hundreds dead, mostly Marines, but also all of the regional CIA station chiefs and the Middle East National Intelligence Officer, who were all meeting in the embassy on the day of the attack. The National Intelligence Officer in question was named Robert Ames, and the biographer Kai Bird has a book about him called The Good Spy, which I think is worth reading. Perhaps the most amazing thing about this episode was the ease with which Reagan walked away from a supposedly vital commitment when it got awkward. I can't imagine that happening today. It's inconceivable. And he managed to do it again a few years later after his attempt to punish Libya for a terrorist attack launched in what was then West Berlin. The U.S. airstrike in response failed to kill the Libyan leader, Muammar Gaddafi. The U.S. was not in a position to get another bite at that apple. Gaddafi, however, responded by conspiring successfully to destroy an American jumbo jet over Lockerbie, Scotland, killing hundreds, including many Syracuse University students returning from study abroad. The U.S. condemned the attack, of course, but it never responded militarily. There were simply no good options, and Reagan got away with it. There was no lingering controversy about that, except perhaps from the families of the victims, who were very active politically. But the really riveting thing about Reagan's Middle East policy was the White House focus on Iran. Even during the 1980 election season, the Reagan campaign had reached out to Iran for help in hobbling Carter's re-election efforts by withholding the release of American hostages the Iranians had seized in November 1979, and to hold them until after Election Day. There's a very good book on this, and I followed up with a great deal of research before I signed on to this claim in the book, and was quite relieved, as you might imagine, by reports in the New York Times a few months ago that one of the participants in that conspiracy had come forward to disclose it from an eyewitness perspective, and that was on the front page of the New York Times. No surprise. Well, Reagan paid Iran back. And he did so by transferring U.S. weapons through Israel to Iran. Iran needed those weapons because it was in a brutal war, like World War I, with Iraq. While the U.S. was officially supporting Iraq during this period, the CIA was advocating a balanced approach, or what they thought was a balanced approach, that favored Iran. And Graham Fuller, who was the national intelligence officer who replaced Robert Ames, wrote a memo that said this, and it had a volcanic effect. I could still remember the head of the policy planning staff at the State Department looking at this memo for the first time and watching his head explode. But he was very vocal. But the thing is that the memo was decisive, and it did signal a shift in U.S. policy that ultimately turned into the Iranian half of the Iran-Contra scandal that blighted Reagan's second term. Okay, so the United States in this scandal sold weapons to the Iranians through a private sector intermediary at a huge markup. And the profits from the deal were funneled to the Contras, an anti-communist resistance group in Nicaragua, to support them after the U.S. Congress had cut off appropriations for that purpose. Now, Let me be the first to tell you, if you go to Washington, don't use non-appropriated funds for government purposes. It's against the law. Okay. But the interesting thing was Reagan's willingness, overall, the interesting thing was Reagan's willingness to overlook the nature of Iran's regime in pursuit of his assessment of U.S. strategic requirements. That's another thing that, for better or worse, would be inconceivable now. The George H.W. Bush administration, which I had long admired, also betrayed serious flaws. Apart from his preoccupation with a new world order that was both utopian and imperial, that is, a grand illusion, in the run-up to Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait in 1990, he issued a presidential decision directive that instructed the United States government to improve relations with Iran, expand trade, and so forth, except, of course, with respect to proliferation technology, and in general cozy up to the regime. That's why you see all these pictures of the Senate Majority Leader at the time, Bob Dole, in Baghdad shaking hands with Saddam. The Iraqis had to buy a lot of grain, and, by God, it was going to come from Kansas or nowhere. So, Congress had a big stake in this. Anyway, in the process of cozying up to Iran, the administration lost whatever opportunity it might have had to deter aggression, Iraqi aggression against Kuwait. When that did take place, alternatives to the use of force were discarded deliberately and immediately, as Bush and his national security advisor, Brent Scowcroft, made clear in their invaluable book, A World Transformed. I recommend it, actually. In Congress, this approach was challenged on both sides of the aisle in the kind of thoughtful debate one does not see anymore. And the congressional statements, from that period have been compiled into a really interesting book. I use it in some classes. You read through that book and you think, wait a second, senators and congressmen could do that? I mean, they talked in paragraphs. It was really something. The campaign plan, and here's where it gets complicated. The campaign plan for the U.S. war was based on a striking miscalculation of Iraqi military power, which in turn led to planning errors that allowed much of Saddam's elite divisions to escape the trap that had been set for them. If you bear with me for a minute, I have a campaign map I'm just going to show, because it's difficult to grasp unless you actually are looking at the map. I'm sparing you a lot of agony. You can see that. Okay, so you get it, right? Just kidding. These maps are like spaghetti, and they have the special symbols, which I'm not going to bother to unpack to you right now. But see, the plan was. It's like a TED Talk. The plan was. Can you all hear me? No. I couldn't actually hear your answer, so yes. What happened here was there was this plan to, as the U.S. chairman of the staff, to kill the Republican Guard as well, so that was the conditions that were that seems to work. Hello, this is London calling. Yeah, all right. So let's cut to the chase here. The idea was that the United States was going to kill the Republican Guard. Without the Republican Guard, Saddam Hussein would be a sitting duck for a coup. or a rebellion that might or might not break out in Iraq. So the idea was to have a hammer and anvil thing. So the anvil were the Marines. Where are you? 1st Marine Division and 2nd Marine Division, 2 Marine divisions, to go up north, drive through Kuwait along the coast to the airport, and suck the Iraqi troops into a violent battle against the incoming Marines. 2 divisions is not nothing. And in the Marines, so, that's like worth 3 Army divisions. just kidding. But the commander of the Marines was General Walt Boomer, which was, I always thought was just great. So Boomer's Marines are going that way. And then you have a whole corps, Army Corps, that's sitting out here in the desert. And the idea is that it's 7th Corps. They've just come from Europe under the command of Fred Franks, I think his name was, a lieutenant general. So, and that's a huge force, okay? That's tens of thousands of soldiers. It's millions of gallons of gasoline. It's, bowling alleys, everything, okay? It's a huge force. And they're all postured in Saudi Arabia, just south of, where the Kuwait-Saudi border is. And the idea is they're supposed to blast through, being led by the 18th Airborne Corps, and then, and that's a French paratrooper unit up there, and they're going to swing right over the top of Kuwait. And as Boomer's Marines are preoccupying the 3 Republican Guard divisions that are in Kuwait, Fred Franks's corps swings over the top, cuts the road from Kuwait to Baghdad, trapping 3 divisions, hammer and anvil. Okay. So what happened was that Boomer's Marines went through Kuwait like a hot knife through butter. And instead of sucking Iraqi troops in for a battle that would keep them preoccupied while Franks swung around to trap them, the Marines were like a piston that were pushing the 3 divisions, the 3 Iraqi divisions, out of Kuwait up to the Kuwait-Baghdad highway so they could get the hell out of there. That all happened so fast that Franks couldn't move his corps fast enough because the jump-off time was it was miscalculated because of misunderstanding of how well the Iraqis would be able to resist the Marines in Kuwait. The upshot was the 3 divisions win. Now, I needed to go through all that detail for a reason, and I hope it's kind of becomes clear. Anyway, President Bush declares the war over, not knowing that this has happened. The president and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staffs think, we killed him. We got him. Now we can stop the war. It's the 100-hour mark. It sounds great. This will be on my tombstone. It'll be fantastic. So in the fog of war, he just didn't know what was going on. So he gets on TV and he says, well, the war's over. And Fred Franks, he's like, pulling his hair out. Like, give me 24 hours and I can, catch these guys. He wasn't given the 24 hours. Okay. The implicit point here is that military outcomes shape diplomatic possibilities, shape diplomatic options. You can't, this military stuff is real important. Are there any ROTC people here, military fellows, anything like that? Oh, yeah?
I mean, I was a veteran, so like real Army, not ROTC.
All right. Yeah, okay, so 4 things then happened in rapid succession. The U.S. pulled its combat power from the region. Within 24 hours, U.S. bombers were gone. They permitted Saddam to fly his combat helicopters, while simultaneously President Bush was encouraging Iraqis to rebel, thus allowing Saddam to use the weapon system designed to suppress an insurgency at the moment it was calling for an insurgency. That's Are we okay? Okay, thank you. And the U.S. also imposed other sweeping measures through the UN on Iraq that were going to be unachievable without a large force there to enforce it. But the large force was gone very quickly. It was a terrible tangle of mistakes that perhaps the administration might have cleaned up in its second term, but of course Bush lost to Clinton in 1992. As I think you'll see, the significance of these errors will be abundantly clear after 9/11. Okay, Clinton, I know it sounds like a forced march, but we're almost there. Almost there. Clinton, in addition to his version of the grand delusion, enlargement, which was infused by the newfangled theory of the end of history, propagated by a Stanford professor who was then on the administration's policy planning staff at the State Department. Clinton destroyed what was left of Iraq after the Bush administration had gotten through with it. Essentially, the administration fixated on weapons of mass destruction that were not there. Now, this was already conceded by CIA. Okay, this is 1995. CIA says, it's nothing. But the sanctions and the inspections continue virtually until 2003. There was a strange psychological trap that the administration got itself into, which was something like this. Every time they went to a site, investigated it, explored it, and found nothing, it just convinced them that there was something elsewhere. Sounds strange, but it's the way they thought. Because each time they didn't find something, it was more evidence of how satanically clever Saddam Hussein was. Well, the upshot was tragic, as we'll see in a minute. I'm going to show you a 10-second clip. Okay, the United Nations in this period issued a report showing that 567,000 Iraqi children had died because of the imposition of sanctions. I don't know if we have sound, but we'll give it a try.
We have heard that 500,000 children have died. I mean, that's more children than died in Hiroshima. And you know, is the price worth it? I think this is a very hard choice, but we think the price is worth it.
words fail, so I'm just going to proceed. But that was the mentality. It's just that's just anyway what it was. Now, the other thing that was strange about Clinton's policy was how he approached the power dilemma, because you can say you've got a vision and want to impose it, but you need to have the power to do it. And you have to believe you have the power to do it. Well, Clinton had decided on a policy which he called dual containment, which was sort of very, my vocabulary is just, eroding in the face of these talking points. But dual containment meant that the United States would contain both Iraq and Iran, two adversaries of the United States. There was a problem, though, in that Iraq and Iran had been balancing against each other. So stability had been purchased at a price paid by America's two principal adversaries, leaving the United States, without a bill coming into their mailbox. Now, people pointed out that the U.S. was going to pay a lot for something it could get for free, and that it was obvious that dual containment in practice was going to leave Iran much stronger than Iraq, and that this would be a problem for the U.S. That was widely predicted, and so it turned out to be. So this left Iraq in U.S. gun sights after 9/11, when Baghdad offered the George W. Bush administration the target it needed to show that the United States was capable of waging war in the Middle East, despite the loss of the Twin Towers, a chunk of the Pentagon, and 3 commercial aircraft. Since the attackers came from Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates, and was staged from Hamburg, Germany, and Afghanistan had already been invaded, so there was really no targets left, especially after this troubled campaign that the United States had waged, which allowed Osama bin Laden to escape to Pakistan. Poor Iraq became the inevitable punching bag. The United States invasion in February 2003 provoked a brutal civil war which killed scores of thousands of Iraqis, 4,000 Americans, and at the strategic level, vaulted Iran into a position of regional power by leveling its only historic adversary, Iraq, a problem the United States is still trying to manage, and did all that at the cost of trillions, most of it borrowed. It was truly astonishing. Congress leapt on board, passing 2 authorizations for the use of military force that functioned and still do function as a blank check for overseas interventions. The sequence of interventions seemed to be on its way out as Obama took office, but the outbreak of the Arab Spring revolts in December 2010 and the spring of 2011 re-triggered the grand delusion. The result was U.S. support for a NATO invasion of Libya, later characterized by a repentant Obama as a shit show. And after months of hesitation, owing to White House skepticism regarding intervention, the administration launched a massive program to arm and train the Syrian opposition to Bashar Assad. As reported by the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, and Washington Post, this was allegedly the largest such program, certainly in dollar terms, that the U.S. had ever launched. Whether it would ultimately have succeeded in compelling Assad to negotiate his departure from Syria with the armed opposition, we will never know, since it was just successful enough to spur Russian intervention. Their first attacks were directed precisely at the armed units that the United States was supplying. It was left to Donald Trump to implicitly declare this, too, to be a shit show, and he shut it down in 2017. Obama did continue to support Saudi and UAE operations in Yemen, but he shifted his focus to getting a multilateral deal to block Iran's pursuit of a nuclear weapon. He succeeded in 2015, but the constituency for it in the U.S. was weak. It was a wedge issue and was doomed upon Trump's 2016 election. It took time for the Trump administration to rip it up because, put on your irony detectors, activate them now. Iran scrupulously abided by the agreement, giving the administration no excuse to withdraw. Iran's compliance was deemed to be a sneaky and underhanded plot to force the U.S. to stick to the agreement. So Iran was declared to be abiding by the letter, but not the spirit of the agreement, and that was that. The way the U.S. permanent representative at the UN, Nikki Haley, now a Republican candidate for the Republican nomination, put it, I'm summarizing here, she said that Iran, by complying with the letter of the agreement, had violated the spirit of it. Okay. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Returning to Obama, it was in his second term that the long arc of intervention that we've been talking about began to decline. I've already mentioned one of Trump's notable Middle East measures. Actually, it was toweringly consequential, not just notable, withdrawing from the nuclear deal. So I'll move on to the other two. When Saudi Arabia was attacked by Iran in 2019, he shrugged his shoulders. And in 2020, he ordered the targeted killing of an Iranian official on Iraqi soil. His shoulder shrug signaled the end of an era that had been launched in 1980 by Jimmy Carter's pledge to defend Gulf oil. That'll be on the exam. The targeted killing seemed to represent an otherwise uncharacteristic penchant for grave risk, but one which was quickly squelched, thereby avoiding a war with Iran. Iran, however, has not forgotten about this and has plans, which it has already attempted unsuccessfully to carry out, to assassinate senior officials. Biden's term is unfinished, of course, but the continuity with Obama and Trump is notable. Mostly, it is to avoid problems with the Saudis, the UAE, and Israel push some Arab-Israeli deal and try and get a placeholder Iran deal, but without returning to the original Obama deal. No grand illusions here. You won't find any words derived from the Greek noun demos in the official statements of the administration relating to the U.S. and the Middle East. The why for this, the explanation seems self-evident given the state of U.S. politics and internationally Russian and Chinese competition. So, okay, before turning, and this is the closing remarks. Before turning to Biden's marquee Middle East initiative, normalization of relations between Saudi Arabia and Israel, and of course the unspooling disaster sparked by Hamas's ghastly assault on Israeli towns bordering Gaza, I'm going to take a minute or two to discuss the U.S. and Saudi Arabia, because that's important for everything that comes after this. First, these two states were present at the creation. They've always been at the core of U.S. Middle East policy. And that's been true since 1945. The thrust of U.S. policy was to ensure the survival of these two states. That was key. They both had to survive. The Saudis, because the West needed unimpeded access to Gulf oil, particularly to fuel reconstruction of Western Europe and enable the Marshall Plan to succeed, a strategic imperative given the vibrancy of European communist parties and uncertainty about Soviet intentions. And Israel for, I think, obvious reasons. Second is that the threat to these two countries was over by 1989. It was finished. At that point, Israel had nuclear weapons, a huge defense industrial base, the strongest army in the Middle East, and by regional standards, a vibrant economy. And Saudi Arabia no longer had any natural predators. Iran really couldn't hurt it. And the Russians were out of the picture. There was no threat to U.S. control over Gulf oil. But it was just at that moment of victory when the United States could have said, Lord, lettest thou thy servant now depart in peace. George H.W. Bush enmeshed the United States in a 30-year conflict in Iraq, which was peripheral to U.S. interests. The tragedy is really unconfined, if I can put it that way. And the last 2 points here are that Israel and Saudi Arabia, that were incubated by the United States no longer exist. Okay, those states are gone. Both states have evolved in such profound ways, they're virtually unrecognizable, and their relationships with the U.S. have changed as well. But U.S. interests have changed. The U.S. now needs Saudi cooperation against China, a strategic priority, and is prepared to pay a very high price for it. And the U.S.-Israel relationship is shifting too. According to recent polling, Americans tend to see Israel as useful in an undefined strategic context, but as not sharing American values. That's a big change. It makes for a more transactional relationship. Okay, I've got some remarks on Gaza. I'm going to hold them for Q&A. So I've talked too long already. I got carried away, and for which I apologize.
Well, thank you very much. As Danny explained, we will get your questions, and we will get to as many of them as we can. We may not cover all of it because of time constraints. And if you write a question, please write it legibly so that I can read your handwriting. So we already have quite a bit of many questions here, and we can kind of group them. But the first one actually is, I think it starts with a personal kind of perspective and then goes to the Israel, Gaza, the problem in the Middle East, and then some bigger questions about U.S. foreign policy. So the first question, it's very interesting, and this person wants to know, how did your job or job focus change as you moved through these different administrations? I guess maybe this is especially with the last two where you had senior positions, but overall, as a government bureaucrat, as you go through these different political administrations, how did that change happen?
That's a good question. I was really the accidental tourist. I entered the bureaucracy, and I just went with the flow, and it was really luck of the draw, if that's what luck is, to be around when significant things in the Middle East were happening. I mean, typically, I was sitting against a back wall taking notes, as we were having a discussion before this meeting, and I said, well, when I was recalling my first diplomatic job, and it was standing out in the sun in 1982 in northern Israel, south of the Lebanese border, counting tanks. That's, But anyway, it went from there to a succession of posts of increasing responsibility. I mean, that is what bureaucracies are supposed to do. So I floated upward until I was asked to join the Clinton NSC as a detailee from the State Department, and I was there for 6 years. For virtually all of the Clinton administration, which really endeared me to the Bush administration when they came in. They said, there's a guy we can trust. So the State Department sent me off into a nice exile in Britain for a number of years. And then once I was sort of a known commodity, and this is true of so many people in D.C., once I was a known commodity, when the Democrats came back in, they said, there's a guy we can trust. So, I wound up at the White House. But I think the short answer is, when I entered government, it was like being in a box and dropped off at the FedEx office. And I was just mailed from one place to another for the next 20 years. So that's.
Okay, thank you. So I think we're going to move to the current situation in the Middle East before we kind of move back a little bit. So there are a number of questions, but one, I know you just wrote something for Foreign Affairs saying what should happen ideally, some scenarios post-conflict. This person wants to know, is another peace treaty like Oslo is possible? Can you imagine something like that? If not, maybe you can talk about what you think should and could happen.
I don't think that, at least for the foreseeable future, an Israeli-Palestinian a peace agreement resulting in Palestinian independence and statehood on Palestinian land. I don't think such a thing is conceivable in the meaningful future, in part because Israeli society has been moving in a direction over the course of a couple of decades now that put the majority of Israelis, I would say, as it's kind of made them very skeptical of the value of a peace agreement with the Palestinians. Although I think a majority of Israelis would tell you right now, yes, two-state solution, fine, we'll have an agreement, and then it'll outline conditions that one understands to be completely unacceptable to the Palestinians. So, there's a trade space there, but neither side is prepared to, put their toe into that trade space. And the way those two societies are developing, it's increasingly likely that they will do so. So no, I don't see that as likely. There are measures, arrangements one could think of as being short of that. Or completely different. Many Palestinians say, well, why don't we just become part of Israel? The Israelis can take the West Bank, that's fine, but we become citizens of Israel. We have identity cards, residence cards, and we vote. Now, there are 1.2 million Palestinian Arabs on the West Bank. And I don't think that Israel wishes to have 1.2 million Palestinian Arabs voting in their country. So the Israelis are not too keen on that. And the social science on binational states of that sort doesn't lead one to be too optimistic. Okay, those situations tend to devolve to civil war. So that's the Israelis aren't going to buy that, and the Palestinians are not going to buy a statehood on the basis on which the Israelis would make it available at this point.
There are several questions about U.S. Policy towards Israel. I'm going to paraphrase them and combine them. Basically, they all revolve around the same issue, and that is, do you think the U.S. Could have been more insistent on criticizing Israel about some of its policies, even in the last 2-3 years? Or in the long term, and if the U.S. could do that, and if they did, would the outcome be any different?
Okay, so if I understand the question correctly, I guess my answer would be the U.S. becomes insistent, or this is historically the case. The U.S. takes an insistent posture when there's a strategic issue at stake for the United States. And then Israel and the United States proceed in their own directions, or Israel, depending upon the circumstances, will bow to the U.S. preference. So in the first Gulf War, when Israelis wanted to attack targets in Iraq and asked for the special codes that would alert American crews that the aircraft on the horizon was friendly, the United States said, no, you enter Israeli airspace, we will shoot you down. You enter Iraqi airspace, and we will shoot you down. Okay? So there was a strategic issue at stake. So the United States said, no, actually, no. If there's no strategic issue at stake, then political considerations dictate accommodation to Israel's request. Because if there's nothing strategic at stake, then paying the political cost of picking a fight with Israel, has vanishingly low marginal rates of return and very high cost. So why would you do it? And I think that's the calculation that almost all American presidents make. So it's really, it's not all that complicated. But where there is a strategic issue at stake, the United States and Israel will either part ways on that issue, or the U.S. will win.
Maybe along the same lines, there are a few questions, but I'll give you an opportunity to summarize your views from your recent article too, and that is, given where things are headed, with or without a major ground offensive, it looks like there will be an attempt to remove Hamas from Gaza. Assuming, I'm not even sure how that will happen, but assuming that something like that happens in one way or another, how do you see that post-conflict situation in Gaza? What do you think should happen? That, of course, refers to the other side of this issue, that is the Palestinians in Gaza.
What I would like to see happen in the event of Israeli success in uprooting the Hamas leadership and weakening its armed forces, destroying its infrastructure, locating weapons caches, rocket factories, and so forth, all the things that are sort of the minimum that the Israelis would want to do once they enter Gaza. If they did all that, then there'd be the question, well, okay, if Hamas is not there anymore, is not in a position to rule Gaza because its instruments of control have been taken away and the leadership has been dealt with violently, I assume, then the Israelis will have to hand off Gaza to some other power, because the alternative would be very burdensome, I think, for Israel, and it would be ugly, because the alternative is an Israeli blockade, presumably, of Gaza that would last for a very long time, punctuated by opportunistic attacks against targets that emerged, over time, and with very little scope for trade or the import of goods that were not humanitarian in nature. So that's a very dystopic scenario. And I don't think the Israelis would want to be responsible for that, and I don't think anybody wants it. So handing off responsibility to a third party would be the way to go. The UN could authorize a mission. Chapter 7 in the UN Charter, Chapter 7 means that the UN mission can use force. The UN authorizes the mission, and then a group of countries gets together and they say, well, okay, we're going to pull together the forces and the competence to move in to Gaza and take control of it. And of course, for that to be a durable scenario, it would have to be linked to some political outcome for Palestinians. Because one would want, the UN certainly wouldn't want to rule over Gaza for the next 100 years. They'll want to hand it off to a Palestinian authority capable of governing it. And I don't think that would be in the cards, and there wouldn't be Arab backing for it unless a reinvigorated Palestinian authority that would take control over Gaza was voted into office by Palestinians. There hasn't been a Palestinian election since 2006. That was the last Palestine Legislative Council election, okay? So the first thing is you'd have to have elections in Palestine. They'd have to elect a government that they trusted. And then that government would need to benefit from the credibility it would get from Israeli concessions. Otherwise, they won't have any real juice. So the question then is, could the United States prevail upon Israel to make those concessions so as to launch this process by which Gaza will shift from the open-air prison it is now to a functioning part of a bigger Palestinian entity of some kind. So a lot of moving parts. But if you ask me how would I like it to look, that's how I'd think it through.
Okay. So there are two more questions. Then, as Danny mentioned, Stephen will sign books outside, so we want to have some time for that. These two questions are very similar. One is more specific to the university, the other is a bit larger, broader. And I will read them. The first one is, what do you recommend we as students can do to work towards the better actions that will allow United States to be in less controversial, money and militarily, etc. position in times like Iran, Iraq, or Gaza? So that is one. And the other is a bit broader. What actions can regular folks do to advocate for human rights for all in the Middle East? What gives you hope in times like this?
So, as far as what students could do for this purpose, which I welcome, it's fairly conventional advice. One is to organize so that you have some kind of, a political structure and the ability to influence the views of elected officials. When it comes, to general elections, I don't know. That's the voter pool is so huge, and the range of issues is so wide, and the importance of foreign policy in general elections is so small. I'm not sure that that's where it makes sense to put your efforts. You really want to put your efforts into your local representatives and the senators from your state. And the way to do that is to organize, and that's sort of the bottom line guidance. And I think you can do it, but it requires a lot of work to have an effect. Secondly, with respect to human rights, I think in the region, prospects are not good. If you sort of traverse in your imagination the political landscape of the Middle East and North Africa, really Iran, to North Africa, and I would even include Turkey here. Human rights are not a priority for the regimes or governments that run any of these countries. And there's and in the Arab Spring, which I sort of saw close up front, where there were fervent, loud demands in the street of almost every Arab capital for human rights, dignity, bread, but human rights sort of very near the top of that list. I mean, actually, bread is, in a sense, a human right. It's certainly an ethical responsibility of the government to arrange things so that people can eat. Well, at the end of the day, the revolutionary governments that took shape in the small number of places where that happened after the Arab Spring have largely failed to consolidate their power, and they're mostly just out of it. And that's happened in Tunisia, Egypt, Algeria. There was never much. Morocco, that's not there. Libya is in many ways a failed state. I mean, there isn't any party who can work to preserve human rights, any party in authority who can do that. Egypt, those days are over. Saudi Arabia, it's an authoritarian state, and I think the same is true of, except for Kuwait, where there's real politics. The other Gulf states really, haven't ponied up to that human rights podium. And Iran, I mean, we see what's happening there. There's a narrowly based regime that's holding on to power, and they violate human rights on a day-to-day basis, and that those violations of human rights are gendered. I don't know if that makes it worse, but it's just, somehow, in my view, it makes it more awful. Syria, well, human rights are simply not enforceable in Syria, and I don't think, people dwell on it because it's so far-fetched a concern. Israel, human rights for Palestinians, that's problematic, to say the least. So Jordan, you can easily get into trouble in Jordan, and it's not a situation you really want to find yourself in. So I get, just going through the landscape, I have to say, it's not a hopeful scenario.
Well, thank you so much. Perhaps if I can add one thing, the answer to the first question in terms of organizing and working through congressmen and women and senators might also have some effect on the conditions in these countries, maybe indirectly. So that is one avenue we can still think about. Well, thank you very much. This has been very interesting. There are, Stephen's books are out there, and he will be out there too for a few minutes. So thank you all for coming.